Welcome to episode 33 of Imperfect Progress. I'm your host, Anne Guzman. Today, I'm sharing a powerful and inspiring episode of my podcast. I had the privilege of diving into the captivating world of professional off-road cyclist Haley Smith. And if you don't know Haley, what I really love about her is that she's incredibly vulnerable. And I think it's a superpower. And I really believe that through her vulnerability, she's very relatable. And we can all see a little bit of ourselves in her in this conversation today. And I think it's incredibly powerful. In this episode, Haley opens up about her personal journey. She tells us about her courageous battle with anorexia. We discuss how cycling became a tool to help her overcome her eating disorder, and also how it's just been incredibly transformative in so many aspects of her life. We dive into the topic of comparison in sports and the invaluable sense of community that she has found within the gravel cycling world. Haley discusses the importance of really embracing the joy in the journey of cycling, setting process-oriented goals, and we talked about the feeling of enoughness and how Haley arrived at the point of really understanding what it feels like to know you are enough. And I really loved this part of our conversation. During this conversation, we talk about how Haley uses data during training or doesn't use data. And she recounts her grueling experience at the Unbound gravel race for us, which is something that she's still working through. We explore Haley's pursuit of other goals outside of cycling and how that's working for her right now as she's on a journey doing her master's in sports psychology. We talk about mindfulness on and off the bike, and honestly, Haley's vulnerability and self-reflection is really awe-inspiring, and it makes this conversation a must listen in my biased opinion. I just thought it was fantastic. So I invite all of you, regardless of whether you're a young athlete, a seasoned racer, a coach, a parent, someone who's out there that loves to be active, step inside, immerse yourself in this discussion. I guarantee you'll gain valuable insights and discover some type of inspiration and really witness the power of vulnerability. Before we jump inside, just a quick reminder. If you are keen on learning more about sports nutrition, sports science, mindset, join the 500 plus athletes, coaches, active people who are signed up to my monthly newsletter. Get it in your inbox, share it with friends and family, stay on top of the latest proven sports science, and stay inspired. How do you get it? Just head to anneguzman.com. That's ANNEGUZMAN.com. You can subscribe at the bottom of any page. Let me know what you love about the newsletter. Drop me an email. Is there something you want me to write about? Let me know. I love hearing from you, and I'm excited to have you in the community. So with that, let's hop inside to the podcast, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. See you inside. Welcome to the podcast, Haley.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me to be on. I'm really looking forward to it.
Me too. I've been excited to have you on, and I mentioned to you before that I've been thinking about it for a while, and so I'm excited that we've come around and here we are. And the reason I wanted to have you on is that I think it's really powerful to have a successful athlete on the show who's taken a bit of your armor down as you have around important topics like mental health and eating disorders. Because to me, in doing this, you've really helped a lot of people to see themselves in you, to realize that it's okay and normal to have struggles. It's going to be okay. And I think that when people see that we all struggle with things and we do find ways and strategies to make it through, that I'm a big believer. It's just important to see a little bit of ourselves and others. So I'm appreciative to have you here.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, sharing sharing that kind of stuff is really important. And it's the only way that I could function, honestly, is to be open about it. So I appreciate you recognizing that. And yeah, I hope I can share some interesting things today, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure. I, of course, went to your website and I've been there before, but I went back on before I came here today and I noticed that you refer to yourself as a professional off road cyclist, a mental health advocate, an anorexia survivor, and someone who wants to inspire others to dream big. So, totally amazing ways to, speak about yourself. And I know a lot of listeners know who you are, and maybe they know you personally or they've heard you talk about your backstory, but maybe some of them haven't. So I would love it if we could just start off and if you could share a little bit about your early days in cycling for anyone who doesn't know how that came to fruition. And then we can slowly unravel through the conversation how your cycling career has evolved and maybe how the sport has been a medium for you to work through a lot of challenges mentally and physically.
Yeah. So I was always an athlete growing up. I played hockey quite competitively and then, did all the other school sports, and soccer and stuff like that. And I was a dancer. And then when I was about to go to high school, I tried mountain biking for the first time. And this was something that my dad and my brother had done, and they kind of introduced me to the sport. And I tried it. I didn't really like it at first. It was really difficult. I was always like bleeding and coming home covered in bruises, but I had a little bit of aptitude for it for some reason. But then I kind of fully unrelated to cycling, ended up at about the same time as this first introduction to mountain biking. I started to develop eating disorder pathology. So, it's a long story, but I had always struggled with anxiety levels, and this anxiety became very food centric when I went to high school. And I ended up hospitalized with an anorexia diagnosis. And so it was a while before I was able to return to cycling after that first introduction and those first few rides I had been on with my dad and my brother. But um, in my recovery process from that initial diagnosis and hospital stay, that's kind of when I found mountain biking in earnest. And
Mhm.
it hasn't been smooth sailing. There's been lots of ups and downs, both precipitated by and improved by biking. Um, but it's kind of been, it's been the only constant apart from family in my life for the last decade, really, decade and a half. Yeah, so I guess we'll get into it, but cycling was how I started my recovery from my eating disorder, and it's taken me all around the world since, and through every spectrum of human emotion that could possibly be experienced.
No, that's amazing. And I'm super grateful that you got the help you did because anyone who isn't aware of the mental illnesses, eating disorders is among one of the top for mortality rates. And it is very serious. And I wanted to ask, did you recognize the seriousness of that at the time, or did you have to have someone essentially walk you in for help? Because I know that sometimes it's really hard to not see it.
So, no, I definitely didn't recognize that I needed help. Um, One of the hallmarks of an eating disorder is typically denial. And I was very firmly of the belief that there was nothing wrong, there was nothing psychologically happening. Um, it's very hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it, but an eating disorder does a very good job of convincing you that your restrictive food habits are as they should be.
Mhm.
So I got progressively more and more sick physically and mentally throughout that grade 9 year. And it was really only because of my mom, who was sort of working with my pediatrician to get me admitted to a hospital, that I ever even confronted that there was something wrong. And it honestly took me many weeks to even believe the diagnosis once I was admitted to hospital. And to be honest, it's taken me years, and I still struggle with understanding what is an eating disorder pathology. So what is an eating disorder thought in my brain, and what is um, a real thought or an actual Haley thought, and not the eating disorder gremlin taking over. So no, I definitely would not have gotten help on my own, didn't realize I needed help. And it was all because of my family that I got the help I needed.
That's amazing. And again, super grateful for them to have been there and been able to recognize that something was going on. And you make such an important point. It must be, and again, I can't speak for you, obviously, but you're taking part in a sport that is so centered around fueling. Someone without an eating disorder is confused about how to fuel for cycling a lot of the time. So it must be really interesting for sure to be like, okay, now I have to eat a lot to do Unbound, but then there's that other conversation in your head, and I can imagine it would be difficult. Do you journal and try and separate the two thought processes? How do you manage that?
I do. To be honest, when I was completely focused on XCO, this was very, very hard to navigate because there is still that, I'll call it historical because it should be gone, but it's still there. But this sort of historical idea that it's all about watts per kilo, which I need to preface by saying it is absolutely not all about watts per kilo in cross country, in bike racing in general. There's so many other more important factors. But there was still that sort of pervasive idea that skinnier was better. And so I really struggled in all of my XCO career with balancing or I guess not giving into that mindset, not letting that viewpoint of how a cross country bike racer needed to be, not letting that take over. I'll go off on a quick little tangent here. You can see from the women who perform really well now that there's all sorts of varied body types in XCO, and it is absolutely not about watts per kilo as the defining factor. But I didn't fully understand that when I was younger. And so now, I guess, since my career has expanded and I've done more disciplines, and it includes events like Unbound, which are 12 plus hours, like you said, you cannot get through those without adequately fueling. And so I think this change into this discipline, or this expansion to include this discipline, has helped me learn how to fuel better and to do so with a positive mental state as well, because it's just so, you fall apart if you don't eat enough. You literally will not make it through these races. So it's a very it's just almost easier in a way to navigate and the push back against your eating disorder a little bit, because the line of underfueling induced failure is very obvious.
Yeah.
It's not as easily obscured as it is in other disciplines.
Right. I mean, huge difference, an hour and a half to 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. When you're going to hit the wall, you got a long way to go.
And it can kind of be disguised in XCO. Like if someone's underfueling, it's maybe a little bit harder to catch, but it's very obvious in gravel racing if someone's underfueling.
Absolutely. And you make a really good point. I just did a conversation with Bridge the Gap the other day, and Chris Rozdilsky from the EF team spoke about this watts per kilo in women's racing. And he's like, we've got to let this go. Like, this is not the goal. And exactly. I mean, you look at the peloton and all shapes and sizes, and he couldn't drive home enough the importance of just being strong and resilient. And that's what we see, right? That's what we see. We just see these strong, resilient, tough women coming out on top. And it's not a look, right? It's just it's not a look. I think it's really fascinating that cycling has helped you to overcome an eating disorder, because what often happens is cycling perpetuates and can even be the trigger for disordered eating. So that's really fascinating. How has it helped you? Like when you first recovered and started cycling more again, how did it help?
Yeah. So, I mean, I will say that it has overwhelmingly, it's helped me, but it also has triggered issues as well in an acute sense at times in my career. But overwhelmingly, it's been a positive. And I think from when I first started, it's similar to how I'm experiencing gravel now, in that I was so underfueled and eating so little that I physically could not have gone for a bike ride when I was at my worst, when the eating disorder kind of hit its peak when I was 14 years old. So the only way to ride my bike was to eat more. And so it kind of like, trial by fire is not the right word, but it's more like, I'm losing my words, but the type of psychological therapy where you're confronted with your fear.
Right. Yeah.
So anyway, so it was like that. So I had that kind of very, very tangible experience of needing to eat. But then I also, it has this mindful component, cycling does, that helped me turn off my brain and which meant turning off the analytical part of me, the Haley part of me, and the eating disorder part of me. And I was just kind of free for an hour or whatever it was while I was riding. And the eating disorder didn't exist while I was out there. And that's probably the biggest part of how it helped me heal, is just that it became my escape and my refuge. And yeah.
Yeah, no, that's super powerful. Exposure therapy is maybe.
Exposure therapy, yes.
Yeah. And no, it took me a minute too. I'm like, I know that we're just trying to find you. No, it makes so much sense. And I relate a lot about just kind of your brain is so present while you're doing sport or cycling in particular, that I come up with great ideas. I'm less stressed when I finished. And it is a way to be mindful. But it makes me think about, if you find that kind of mindfulness on the bike, what happens when you're off the bike? Do you also have a way of creating that sensation within yourself when the bike isn't available and you need some calm?
Yeah, so this is funny because this is something I've struggled with my whole career. It's not been until very recently that I've ever been able to make myself take an off season, because I need this meditative movement. Like, it's how I stay sane. Yep. But I've gotten better at it. And probably since 2017, I've had some sort of formal mindfulness meditation practice off and on. I also have been practicing yoga since I was first diagnosed. So my aunt introduced me to yoga when I was going through this at its peak, and that's been a constant in my life ever since. And it's a similar thing. It's just mindful movement, like in the moment movement. And for me, psychological calm is very tied to movement, so that helps a lot. And then there's just the other like hobbies. I know that sounds silly, but having things that consume my attention, that are not stressful, that sort of just bring me into the moment, like, I don't know, baking, or I took up knitting aggressively for a while, like these
aggressively. I love that. She's pumping out a dozen teddy bears a day.
Yeah, I guess just anything there's lots of different ways to have mindful activities, and lots of ways to do that. But I've kind of experienced a lot of them. Right.
And you have a coloring book, a mindfulness coloring book, don't you?
I do. Yeah, actually. So what year was that? Maybe 2016. I made a coloring book. Yeah, that was something that I did for a while and still periodically do to bring myself into the present. And yeah, so I made that, and it had some other things in it, like some recipes and some journaling pages and whatnot. But yeah, so
very cool.
Still exists some places in the world.
Yeah, it's on your website. So if anyone's keen, I'm pretty sure that's on your website. You've just brought up something really interesting that I did want to speak about at some point today. So I'll go there now. I've noticed something fascinating among some professional cyclists. And what I've noticed is, and I realize this isn't always the case, but for some people, it seems like their performance improves when they engage in some meaningful endeavor beyond cycling. So whether it's pursuing education or running some sort of small business on the side, and you've chosen to pursue a master's in sports psychology. So I'm super curious, Like, what was the thought process leading into that decision? And how has that impacted your training, racing, and even your mental well-being?
Mm-hmm. That's it. There's a lot of questions in there. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so I went back in September of last year for my master's, and it was a long time coming. I graduated from my undergrad in 2015. So it's been whatever that is, like 8 years, 7 years since I've been in school. And you're right. I think a lot of cyclists do start to perform better when they have a secondary or a parallel pursuit. However, there are also times in your life where I think it's okay for cycling to be your primary and sole pursuit.
Yes.
And it depends, I think, on where you're at in your developmental trajectory. And so early on in my development, when I was doing my undergraduate education, it was really valuable to have both. And then as I was pursuing the Olympics, that focus is so singular that I think it's okay, or it was okay at that time in my life to have cycling be, it.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't end up working out as I had hoped, but I think it was an appropriate balance of focus for the time. But post Olympics, I'm now in a place where I've grown and changed, and cycling is not, it's not my whole being anymore. And I think I would be slower if it still were. And so I knew I wanted to go back to school. It took me a really long time to figure out what for. And then I started to think about sports psych. And I've always worked with a sports psychologist. But my experience was encouraged me to pursue something that could improve the sport experience for younger athletes so that they did not end up with the problems that I had. And so I decided to go back to school for this, but I'm in a research-based program that's focusing on understanding positive development for youth through sport. So I may go down the consulting path as well towards the end of my degree, but right now I'm very research focused, and I'm looking at just the developmental implications of sport and how we can improve that experience to proactively prevent things like eating disorders, I guess, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's super
Actively
meaningful.
encourage more positive development. Yeah.
That's amazing. And it's always amazing when you do something that is meaningful to you, relates to your own experience. And again, you're trying to help people to have a different experience. But having said that, this is always a tough one. So, we all have hard times in our lives, and those are all in perspective to whatever we consider hard, right? It's different for everyone. When you go through a really dark time, it sucks. And at the time, it can feel like these things are never going to end. But what I've found is once you go through a really hard time, if you're reflective in your life, you might start to remember that you've made it through something really hard before. And because of that, you can pull on some of that strength. So I never wish hard times on anyone. And I question at times, if I could go back in time, would I rather I hadn't experienced some things in my life that I know have been instrumental in making me become who I am today? So I can't answer that. I really don't. I don't feel like I can answer that. But I do wonder, you're saying, I want to go and pursue this education, and maybe one day I'll counsel athletes and help them not go through the experience that I did. So similar, you probably can't really answer that question, but how much do you think overcoming, and I understand that you still struggle at times with eating disorder, but how much do you think overcoming a lot of your eating disorder and learning to manage even anxiety has contributed to the amazing, strong, resilient woman you are today?
Well, first, thank you.
You're welcome.
I think you're 100% right. Struggle is what builds resilience, and it's what makes us be able to handle progressively bigger challenges. I don't think, I mean, I don't necessarily think that me having an eating disorder was this sort of like divine or pivotal thing that created who I am.
Mm-hmm.
I think having the eating disorder was in some ways a byproduct of who I was, because it was, there are risk factors for developing that kind of
Mm-hmm.
pathology, and I had those personality traits.
Mm-hmm.
I don't wish that I hadn't gone through it. I wish that my family had not had to go through it. But at the same time, I don't think it needed to be an eating disorder. I don't think that needed to be the challenge that taught me resilience. I think
Right.
that you can learn that in many different ways, I think. And I suppose I should go back and say that I don't want to remove challenges that youth experience in sport, but I would like to help improve the structure of the sport experience so that these, like, mental illness does not need to be something that youth experience in sport. Sure, like hardship and challenge need to be part of a positive sport experience, but mental illness doesn't need to be part of that equation. And if it is, I think youth need to be prepared with the resources to confront it, or to, like, seek help. And I think that at the time I didn't have those things. um yeah, I guess I'm getting a little bit off track here, and I
No,
maybe
no,
a
no,
ton
that
of
makes sense what you're saying. So tell me if I'm hearing you right. So you're saying that you want to be able to support athletes through whatever they're going through. Mental illness doesn't have to be a part of being an athlete. There's a lot of other struggles. Of course, we might all be predisposed to certain mental illness because of genetics and other factors. When you were an athlete, what type of resources did you need that weren't available for you that you want athletes to have available to them?
Um, whew, language is probably the first one,
Mm,
and I think that's already changed. Nobody talked about this kind of stuff when I was 14. I didn't know. I mean, I'm sure I did know someone, but I didn't know anyone who had been through an eating disorder because nobody talked about it.
right.
Um, it was like an extremely shameful thing to have gone through when I was in high school. I kept it very secret. Um, so yeah, I think the language to talk about this kind of stuff is really important. Um, but other than that, like, I think the toolkit can be boiled down to having support to navigate these things, like
Mhm.
relationship support from important members of your circle, whether it's family, teammates, coaches, support staff, and then self-knowledge and the ability to be introspective and reflective, like you said. And that's something that we can teach through sport, um,
Yeah,
through leadership style and through sport structure. Um, there are other things, obviously, like access to mental health professionals and that kind of stuff. But I think that I'm more interested on like psychological skills, I suppose, than in directly impacting the provision of services, I guess.
right. Yep.
Um,
You know
yeah,
what would be great? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I'm feeling a little bit confused about exactly what I'm trying to say. Um, but overall, I think my goal, or I can't even call it a goal, my wish is that throughout my life in sport and in academia, I'm able to have some sort of impact on the youth sport experience, such that it helps more kids experience more positive outcomes. And that doesn't mean no challenges. It just means positive outcomes. And those are often contingent on going through challenges, but um, having the appropriate skills to manage them.
Absolutely. And youth and even older athletes. I mean, I think so many of us don't have all of those skills when we're 30, 40, and 50. Just think in general, speaking about all of our struggles and having professionals or, you know, resources we can go to learn the skills, even within the coaching community. Like, I can imagine how amazing it will be when professionals in mental health and sports psychology are teaching coaches how to help the athletes and how to speak with them, the language that they're using, and build trusting relationships. And it's so hard because we hear all of these stories about non-trusting relationships in sport, right? Which are horrific, but there's so much work to be done. So I think the work that you want to do is incredibly important.
Yeah. And I'm lucky that I found a lab the lab that I'm working in is so focused on this. And I kind of what you were in continuance of what you were just saying, safe sport is a very serious thing that needs to be addressed all over the world, but in particular in Canada right now. But there's another layer to the sport experience. Like, yes, we need to make it safe 100%, but we also need to make it assets focused and positive and focused on positive outcomes, not just on the mitigation of, or like the elimination of these negative, really harmful experiences. And anyways, I think, like you said, teaching coaches the like proper, not proper, but supportive language and supportive or encouraging leadership styles and these kinds of things they have really concrete impacts on youth development. And anyways, I'm very lucky that I've had really positive role models and coaches in my sport experience. And I don't think I would have gotten through. I know I would not have gotten through my eating disorder, definitely would not have gone to the Olympics if it weren't for how lucky I got with my coaching. Anyways,
that's amazing.
That's a tangent, but yeah.
No, it's good. And you're making such an important point, because as a youth athlete or someone that's a bit older, if you're not having fun, why, right? And it's painful for me to imagine a young athlete already not having fun because of the type of coaching. So you're right. It should be encouraging. It shouldn't be about times and everything so young. Like, you want to just nourish an enjoyment of sport in general. And we all know that most Olympians are not made by specifying in their sport when they're 6 years old. That's the minority, right? So sport should be this enjoyable thing. And, whether you end up coaching someone who's in cycling or soccer or hockey, you're just instilling these outcomes that are more around enjoying the sport, and whichever direction they go, they're going to take that with them. And that's just can impact your whole life. You're right. Like, a coach is such a powerful thing. And I'm grateful that you had all that support, because it obviously made a huge difference.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's kind of like three levels of outcomes that you can hope for in sport. And there's kind of like the day-to-day, which you were talking about, like fun and enjoyment and building interest and inquisitiveness. And then you have sort of medium-term outcomes, which would be building good character traits, building confidence, that kind of things. And then you have your long-term outcomes, which can be performance, long-term participation, so lifelong participation in sport. And good sport will nurture all three of those levels. And at the same time, like, they're all interdependent. Like, you're not going to have, like you said, you're not going to have long-term performance or participation if there's not an element of enjoyment in the day-to-day. And so they're just all dependent on each other. And I think sometimes sport gets so focused on the long-term outcome of performance that the basic building blocks are missed. And make no mistake, fun is part of the basic building blocks of success. And some people think that that's silly, or they're like, they want you to harden up and just do the work. But the purpose of life is not just to do the work, in my opinion. Like, that would suck. So
Absolutely. No, I think that's super important. It's not just all about being tough as nails. Of course, that matters at some point, but you're making me think about enoughness and how much, as young and older athletes, I hate to always just say young, because I think that at every age we can experience so many of these struggles. How much do you think, a lot of athletes tie like their self-worth into their outcome in a sport. So what place you're in, how fast you're going, comparing yourself to others. How have you dealt with the concept of enoughness? Like, I am enough. And has that changed for you?
Cool. So yes and no, it has and has not changed. I think that this is maybe a pessimistic outlook, but I would challenge you to find a single Olympian who didn't at least in some way get to the Olympics because they needed to prove to themselves that they were enough.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the only motivation, but I think it's there for a lot of people in sport. I think I'm at a place right now where I can both accept that I am enough and sometimes and appreciate that however and whoever I am in whatever way I can show up on the day is enough.
Yeah.
But sometimes I struggle with believing that or, with the confidence to accept that. And I think that's actually what confidence is. Confidence is believing that you can show up and be you and it'll be okay. Confidence is not like the bravado of knowing you're going to win. It's a rock steady belief that it'll be fine because being you is good enough.
Exactly.
So some days I feel confident in that way and some days I don't. But I think the majority of the time I feel that way now. And in my past, it was definitely skewed towards not feeling that way. And I think the way that I kind of hit that inflection point of feeling more confident was hitting rock bottom. And yeah, I mean, if I hitting rock bottom in terms of both health and performance. And as horrible as that whole experience was of being at like the literal bottom of the well, it was so necessary because the sun rose the next day.
Yeah.
And not everything wasn't fine, but it was fine. And I made it through and the world didn't stop spinning. And my family still loved me and all those sorts of things that kind of helped me appreciate that life is more than sport. I think sport, to semi quote Danny Rojas, sport is life, but it's more than that. And that perspective, I think I could only have learned through utter failure and then realizing that doing this sport is a choice that I make because I love it, not because it's something I need to do to prove my worth.
That's so powerful. I mean, honestly, if we just took that clip and that was the whole podcast, it would be huge. And I think that takes so much work to get there. And I think what you're saying is so powerful that when you, as you say, hit rock bottom, the people who loved you still loved you. Whether you were first or you were last, you were just as valuable to the people who loved you. And anyone who thought of you as less valuable during that time was not someone who loved you, right?
Yeah.
So you're around the right people who your value doesn't change. You come into this world 100% enough, and nothing you do or nothing anyone says to you can change that. And I think that's so important to remember. Like when you start the race, if you can start with that mentality that this is going to be hard, maybe I do amazing, maybe I have a rough day, but when I cross the line, like nothing changed. I'm still 100% enough. Wow, that's confidence. And I didn't have that when I was racing, but I'm a lot older now. And I can imagine if I did show up on the line like that, racing would have been way more enjoyable.
Yeah. And it's a lot more free to race that way. And I would be lying if I said I show up every race and am able to have that mindset. But something that helps me is remembering that next year, I mean, let alone next year, like next week, nobody is going to remember, or the vast, vast majority of people do not remember or care about the results of the race you just did. Mm-hmm. So like the idea that you have to do it to prove, or do a certain result to prove worth or to gain worth is just not true, because it's not that isn't where worth is located. And you can see that by what people remember and what people value. And so I think that realization, or like bringing that realization to the fore of my mind when I go to do races, helps me just say, well, then why am I doing this? And more often than not, it's for some sort of intrinsic reason. Like I want to see how hard I can go, or I love competition and I want to be in the game.
Yeah.
And those kinds of reasons, when they're at the fore, racing it flows better.
Absolutely. And I love that you say it's a choice. Like sometimes I think I get to work out. That's how I think of it now. And I don't race anymore, but sometimes you're injured and you can't work out and all you want to do is work out. And then you can work out and you're like, oh, I don't want to go train. So it's like, to remember that it's like, hold on a second. I get to work out. I'm super lucky. And I know it's hard. It's not always so easy to have that mentality, but I want to ask you, since you just said, it is a choice. I read your Instagram post after Unbound, and you mentioned that you went into some uncharted emotional territory, like a super dark place. It sounds like you found some new limits. I'm wondering, what were you thinking during that time? Can you share a bit about your inner dialogue and how did you make it through that? What was the mentality then?
So Unbound this year was traumatic, which it's such a privileged thing to be able to say that this expensive bike race that I lined up for was a traumatic experience, but it honestly was. And I was sick. So in the week or two preceding Unbound, I had ended up with food poisoning, and I struggled for a while, like many days to eat. And anyways, I lined up on the start line at Unbound already feeling pretty sick. And then it was a very, very difficult physical experience. And I had cognitive responses to it. So I wouldn't even say it was emotional. It was like I was having panic attacks because I couldn't breathe because my diaphragm wasn't working because my stomach was so distended, and just weird physical things. Like the panic attacks were probably the hardest thing to deal with while in a race environment. I wanted to, I didn't actually, that's a mistake to say. I did not want to quit. I actually thought I needed to quit, which was something I'd never experienced before. I pretty much want to quit every race I do at some point. It's really hard, but I didn't want to quit. I was like, I will not make it through this event. Anyway, so to be honest, I can't yet pull value from that experience. I finished because I had set a goal to finish, and because my support team was out there for me, and I had seen my partner and my partner/husband not be able to finish because of a mechanical not a mechanical failure, but like a mud-induced mechanical. And so I knew that he didn't get to have the experience he wanted, and I was lucky to be out there trying to have an experience. So I finished, and I found out that I'm really, really tough. But I also don't know if I needed to find that out. I think that showed me that I'm in a place where beyond proving a race result, I don't need to prove my toughness to anybody. I know I'm tough.
Yeah.
So, and that includes to myself. So I'm not really sure if finishing actually was the right call, or if it was intelligent or healthy. And I don't feel stronger for having done it.
That's powerful. No, you're making a great point right now.
Yeah.
I mean, you're making a great point about, I don't want to use the word quit, but not finishing a race, a DNF. A lot of times people see a DNF and think, oh my God, a DNF. But, sometimes it's the smart decision to make. And I guess it comes back to the enoughness. You made it for the right decision. Had you pulled out, it would have been for your health. And knowing that that's okay would have been okay. So it is, I can understand why you might be thinking, I don't know if it was a good idea. It makes sense what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think I probably finished because I didn't, because I knew I didn't have to. Like, I knew I didn't have to in order to prove anything to myself or otherwise. Like, I think if I was carrying that burden, the panic attacks would have been a lot more severe, and there would have been a lot of heavy, like the weight of my world would have been on my shoulders. And because it wasn't, I was able to finish. But if that weight had been there, it would have required a lot more psychological strength to get through.
Right.
But yeah.
Huh, crazy. Well, I mean, you did finish, and we all know, and you know that you're tough. maybe you never figure out what the point was, or right. That's okay too. But I'm glad you're okay, and I'm amazed that you somehow managed through a panic attack during a race. Did you have to pull over? Like, how did you do that? Because I know you can barely breathe when that's happening.
No, so I was with a friend / competitor named Sarah Sturm. And when it started to get really bad, when I was like hyperventilating, she just, I might cry saying this, but
That's
she
okay.
just talked me through it. Like, she refused to leave me, which is, I mean, we're racing, and she refused to leave me. And she just basically talked me through step by step, just continuing to go.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, I haven't even mentioned Sarah, but she's probably one of the major reasons why I finished that race, because if I had been alone or had not been with someone who like understood my vulnerabilities, I don't think I would have had the support to get through it. And that's something that's really interesting about gravel, actually, is that it is a collective solo pursuit. Like, even the people that you're racing head to head with, these events are so ridiculous that you don't get through it without each other.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I think, really neat. Anyways, so
I got
yeah.
goosebumps listening to that. I mean, I think that's, yeah, it's the sense I get about gravel just watching. I mean, I'm watching from the outside. I'm not there at the races, but reminds me a little bit of when I used to do cross. But the community, I come from road cycling, and to me, the cross community, and I'm not bashing road cycling, it was just different. It was more chill and a little bit more intimate and open and more vulnerable versus, I don't know, I can't even put a word or a name to it, but how does it compare to being on the World Cup? And again, it's not a comment on the people there. It's a comment on the cultures. Like, what are the differences there that you feel?
Well, so gravel is definitely becoming quite serious. There's a lot of money in it. There's a lot of very high profile athletes that are all looking to perform. But there's an element that the World Cup doesn't have, and that's that these are physical challenges simply to complete. And there are points out there where you legitimately might feel at risk. Like, you might feel like you've put yourself in a position that's beyond your limit or beyond what you're capable of.
Mm-hmm.
And so that encourages an environment where competitors stay extremely fierce, but are also collaborative. So, like, sharing food and sharing water and sharing a draft, and like all of those things are very commonplace. But in the World Cup, it's like you're literally never more than like 2 feet from a person, a spectator or a marshal or someone like that. Like, there's never anything that requires you to be collaborative with your competitors, because it's an extremely controlled environment.
Mm-hmm.
That said, it's mountain biking, so it's extremely uncontrolled, and you'd consider it an open system sport. But it's an environment where you're always like, it's connected to civilization, I suppose, or connected to infrastructure and that kind of stuff. So it's just, when you're out there, it is a more me versus, it can be a much more me versus everybody else attitude. And while that still can exist in gravel, there's just a little bit more collaboration. Plus, no one's going to be like, the intensity is a little bit lower on average. There are extremely intense parts of gravel racing, but you can't go absolutely bananas for 5+ hours. So there are times when there is a little bit of a social experience within the race, and you might share a joke or like talk to each other. And that
Mhm.
doesn't happen in World Cup
Right.
racing. So it's just a unique environment, I guess.
Right. And I didn't mean to glaze over Sarah, because I have to come back to her for a second and say that I've read several times that this woman is just an incredibly compassionate competitor. And what I sense in gravel, and of course, there's amazing sportsmanship in World Cup racing as well. But like you're saying, there's an opportunity during the race when your guard is kind of down 5 hours into a race to probably have a bit more sportsmanship and connection. Because if you had a panic attack during a World Cup, everyone would be there in a heartbeat, right? So you're right, it's different. You're out in the middle of who knows where during Unbound. It's extremely vulnerable. It feels like it would be a very different experience.
Yeah, for sure. Like, so it's mandatory at those events that you race with a cell phone. And I broke the rules and didn't race with my cell phone because I knew it was going to rain.
Oh, okay.
So I knew that like we're in the middle of nowhere. Even if I had a cell phone, there's actually no cell reception. So I either have to get to this first checkpoint or I'm walking 50 miles to try to find somebody. Like you are
Wow.
very much out there, right? So anyway, so that's where like someone like Sarah, they get you through it, and you need each other. You need each other in an event like that.
Yeah. No, that's powerful. I'm curious to ask you about a little bit of a pivot, but data. And I know that everyone uses data these days. So in whether it's a 5 hour or World Cup, sometimes you see people cross the line and bang, they go down and they finish on their Garmin, press the stop button, no matter what the race, like World Championship, they reach down and touch the button. So I know that we can measure everything now. And I'm curious, I think that measuring can be productive and useful, but I also think it can be destructive. I would say the same for nutrition, by the way, but I'm talking about racing data right now. So in retrospect, I've underperformed in the past because I was looking at my data and I limited myself. And when I finished an event, I thought I totally didn't empty the tank because I saw a number and I thought I've never gone that hard before, I'm going to blow. And so I didn't go harder. I'll never forget that. So had I listened to myself, I know I would have performed better on that day. But on the other hand, you have all this power data. It can be very motivating during intervals, or you can see, your fatigue adding up on your TSS or whatever you look at. So I'm curious, how do you harness, I guess, the constructive potential of data? And then personally, have you encountered instances where seeing data has just made you feel anxious?
Yeah. So, okay. So data, I do use a power meter, but I'll get to how I use it in a second here. But I think when you are new to the sport in your first several years, you can pretty much expect to see improvement all the time. Like it comes not easily, but you are on an upward trajectory in terms of power numbers. And then you get to a point where the improvements become less frequent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your performance won't continue to improve, because there's a whole lot of other factors that can be improved beyond power. And that's just kind of like the low hanging fruit. So for me anyways, in those first many years, my power meter was very motivating because I was seeing these increases all the time. Importantly, I got to a point where there were a couple years where I wasn't seeing like measurable power improvements, but my performance was still improving and I had some of the best results of my career. So that's just sort of an aside there. But I use power retrospectively. So I don't use it, like I have it recording when I'm out training, but I don't look at it. I don't do intervals by power. And if I do, it would be a very wide range, and it would only be at submaximal intensity. So for example, I might do, like, if I'm doing a tempo workout, I might have a 30-watt range where I'll know roughly that I should be in there. But I also, I don't have that as a screen that I look at during the interval. I would have to go to like a separate screen to check in on it. But the screen I look at does not have power on it. My best race results I have not had a power meter on my bike, or I didn't have my computer visible.
Mhm.
These are all kind of disjointed thoughts, but I guess what I'm saying is that I have learned that power can be motivating, but much, much more important is learning what sensations you can handle and how to listen to your sensations, when to listen to them and when not to listen to them. Yeah, and then there's another element there too of power meters are wildly different. So if you have a different power meter every year, you can't compare them. So people get all wrapped up in, well, I'm 3% worse this year compared to last year, but it could just be the difference in how your power meter is reading compared to your old one.
Right.
Between brands, within brands, like there's all sorts of variety. So I guess my short answer for this question is that I look at power with one eye closed after the fact when I'm kind of looking at my Training Peaks file. But I know that as long as I have the watts that get me in the ballpark, racing is about racing. It's about racecraft. It's not about looking at the number. So I just don't use it. Like my screen that's visible when I do any kind of racing, whether it's cross country short track or unbound, is a map screen that has maybe my cadence and
Mhm.
then my heart rate at the top. I don't even really look at heart rate. It's just there to like, in case I want to see something. But other than that, like I see the GPS heading and that's it.
Right. And this is really refreshing because I'm sure a lot of people are listening who are incredibly focused on every moment of data. And like you said, maybe early on when you're getting those large improvements quickly, it's like, oh, that's amazing. But it could almost be frustrating when you're at such a peak fitness that it's like, oh, it's really hard to get a little edge above that. So do you really stay fixated on that? And then I guess even as far as comparing yourself to yourself, how are you measuring progress? Is it from your retrospective looking at data, or are you thinking of progress in a way bigger lens of like process goals and your attitude towards a race? And it can't be just measured on pure outcomes because then that would be relative to your competitor's fitness as well. So how do
Mhm.
you measure progress for yourself? Like, what does that look like?
Well, I did used to use numbers like outcome, like wattage to measure progress when it was coming more frequently in my earlier years. But now I think I've learned to look at training as a process that creates the potential for you to improve. So I used to try to see improvements in every single day of training, but now I understand that that's you're not going to improve every day, but you can be working on things every day that might make you improve.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do use racing as the kind of litmus test to measure improvement, but it is about way more than results because I mean, year over year results or, yeah, like you said, relationship to your competitors, you're a different you every time you show up, whether it's from year to year or weekend to weekend. And so you can't expect yourself to be constantly improving on your best ever result because that would be you're never going to relive that exact same circumstance where you show up as the same you and everybody else shows up as the same them. So there has to be other factors. And I do look at I would like look at power and time in zones. I would look at pedaling efficiency. I would look at how well I cornered and descended. I would look at, like you said, the attitude that I brought to it.
Mm-hmm.
My tactical performance and whether or not I capitalized on the right scenarios. There's usually about like 10 things that I would remark on in my Training Peaks comments that range from like hydration and cooling all the way up to like the very nitty gritty of like power output and cadence and stuff like that. So it kind of covers the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
But I think more so now I'm searching for improvement, but I'm more searching. I more look for execution and satisfaction with my execution. And some days that'll be an improvement objectively, and some days it might like be way worse than other races. But if I can leave knowing that I'm satisfied with how I went on that day with what I had there, then I'm happy. And that also creates motivation to try to improve the execution for the next time.
Right. I think it's so important what you're saying, all of these different elements that you have as process goals. And I think sometimes as younger athletes, we forget about those. And I'm sure in work with the sports psychologist, that's probably been really useful, because I know that's such a big part of sports psychology, is not just having that outcome goal, because if you don't reach it, well, geez, that's not very motivating. So how about all the little things in between, and which aren't little, they're big things? How about all the other things about the process that you can pat yourself on the back on if you come last? Right. Well, I still did this and I still did that, and I did eat well. And I mean, that's so important. Like, holy, look at the wins, instead of if you just have one outcome, could be really self-defeating.
Yeah. And the wins are made up of, like, the wins happen because of the process.
Yes.
So if you set these process goals, then, and you're working on them, then that is how you get to your end goal. And speaking as someone who has experienced what for me was like immense success, for like what my expectations of myself were, that's not actually, like, that feels pretty empty after a couple days. Like, it's not, searching for those outcomes is just not long-term fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so cliche, but focusing on the process is fulfilling, both making improvements in the process and just being immersed in it. That is where the joy comes from. And that's where motivation and fulfillment and like the longevity of your career, that is found in whether or not you can derive happiness from that process, I think. So anyways.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, if you're not enjoying it, eventually it becomes stressful, and that becomes obvious in your performance and in your life, right? You have to question that.
And if it doesn't become stressful, it becomes flat. Like there has to be that that's a little bit of spark of magic, a little bit of whatever that is. Like I think that's kind of everyone, it'll be different for everybody, but that kind of X factor that is, it's emotional and it's enjoyment is maybe not quite the right word, because it can be frustrating at times, but perhaps engagement is
Mm-hmm.
describes it better. There just has to be that that curiosity there, that sort of the willingness to explore and enjoy and have fun and I don't know.
Right. And for athletes,
Yeah.
struggle can be enjoyable. And I don't think enjoyable is a
Yeah.
word either, but I think we like that. I mean, I like to suffer physically. So it's like, yeah, in the moment, you're not laughing necessarily, but you're satisfied that you pushed
Yeah.
yourself and you've expanded. You mentioned comparison in there. And I think it's such an important topic, and especially in the light of social media, but even without social media, because we mentioned briefly, well, you can't really rank your performance based on someone else, because what if someone else comes into the season having the year of the month of their life and you're still fitter than last year? And I'll never forget, someone I coached once finished a time trial, and we texted and it was like, oh, how'd it go? And he's like, oh, it went really well. I left it all out there. Best time trial I've ever had. Then they saw the result sheet and they didn't do very well. And suddenly they were devastated.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just so powerful to me that the joy in one moment was just taken away from someone else's time. And I get it. It's sport, right? A lot of people, one of the outcomes, you want to win, you want to do well. But that to me was just like, oh man, on any given day, you can have such a great ride and someone can have a better one. Or you can have such, a great ride and someone else can have not a great ride. But to put in your mind that, oh, I'm amazing, so-and-so had a bad day. You don't know that. Or I suck, so-and-so had an amazing day. It's just so it's such a powerful thing that can really mess with your mind. So have you dealt a lot with that, and how have you improved, if so?
Yeah, definitely 100% have dealt with that and still deal with it from time to time. I think for me, the key is being very clear and honest about why I want to do this, why I want to race bikes. And when I put a lot of work into understanding that, and winning is part of that, but it's like a corner of, if I drew like a mind map of my why, winning is kind of like a little bit of the corner.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and more than that, it is this, I can't really articulate it verbally. I actually have like a mind map that I made that's like a collage of pictures that I did.
Awesome.
But it's just, I chase this sense of fulfillment and satisfaction, and it's almost like peace, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
with my performance. Like, that is what I'm after. And if I remind myself of that, which I do with journaling before every race, actually, then it's just, you can't lose your joy because of comparison, because that outcome is not contingent on anyone else. And sure, that one little corner of the mind map might feel let down if I lose or if I underperform. But the other stuff, like, I consciously make an effort to understand how the other elements were fulfilled, or if they were fulfilled. And so I guess that's just a mental exercise that I do, maybe both before and after a race, that helps bring my focus to what I want my focus to be, as opposed to like the easy focus, which is just on a result.
Mm-hmm. That's
Anyways,
powerful. No, I'm trying to imagine what your visual looks like, but that sounds like a
it has
great,
like a
great
tree on
exercise.
it, and it has a tree in the middle, and it has a bunch of words that are on the branches and a lot of other symbols. But it would make zero sense to anyone else. But
You never know. You
anyways,
should put it in your book that you sell.
yeah,
Someone might love that. No, that sounds really smart, right? And like you said, I'm sure sometimes everyone gets sucked back into it, and that's just being human. But it sounds like
yeah.
you have a great strategy, because you're intentionally drawing and journaling about what you want versus just letting other things dictate your mindset. That's huge.
Yeah, and that's something that came from my sports psychologist. And the mental performance is not an accident. Confidence is not an accident. It's not something that you either have or you don't. It's something that you train, just like you train your legs. And so it does require a little bit of discipline to do these kinds of exercises, but they have an impact. 100%, they have an impact, and that impact is unique because it extends far beyond your race results. It bleeds into your outlook on life, and like what you bring to life outside of sport. Anyway, so yeah, like this has been this is probably part of how biking has helped me recover, to bring it full circle, is
Mm-hmm.
that I've had to I've had to work on these mental, um I can't think of the word, but these
Strategies.
foundational beliefs about life and about why I'm alive, and like what I want out of life. I've had to work on those in order to perform, and that's helped me with my mental health as well.
Yeah. No, it's super powerful. It's amazing. And you make such an important point that it's intentional. It's work. It doesn't just happen. We can't just hope for it. I'm going to ask you a last question, but before I do, I'm just wondering, is there anything else that, if someone's out there listening, whatever stage they might be in their cycling career, that you want to leave them with?
Oh, I think what I forgot at times, I probably have a different answer to this question every time it's asked, because it depends on the context that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But I think if I were to go back, I would say that the one mistake I made is forgetting at times why and what the point of what I was doing is. And that extends to many things. Like, sometimes I would forget, well, am I out here training to get fast? Am I fueling to get fast? Or or is my eating disorder taking over? And am I just riding to, like, manage weight or whatever. Like, so there's that element of it. I've forgotten the why in terms of trying to make selections and like letting those drive where I go in the sport. Like, it covers forgetting your why has implications across every element of your sport experience. So I think that I guess I would just tell people to try to be in touch with that as often as you can, and to cultivate a strong why. And that will be your compass that takes you where you need and should go through sport.
Right. No, that's powerful. Thanks so much for that. Well, I want to ask you my last question. This has been an amazing conversation. And again, I'm so appreciative of your openness. And at one point you mentioned shame. And I think that what melts our shame away is talking. So I think that's really powerful what you're doing. And I hope that you can inspire other people to talk about anything they might be struggling with. The name of my podcast is Imperfect Progress. And I named it that because the older I get, I just find that everything is exactly that, very imperfect. And I can have all of these visions and I can meditate about how I want it to be. And rarely does it just go from line A to B nice and straight. And we all have to figure out ways to manage that when things don't go the way we want them. And that's just part of life. So I wanted to ask you, when you run into adversity, do you have any mantras, or how do you talk to yourself? What's going through your mind? And if anyone's listening right now, the reason I like to ask this question is because everyone answers it so differently. And maybe someone listening will really resonate with some of your process and they'll take it on themselves. So how do you navigate imperfect progress?
So in terms of mantras, this is something I use very frequently in racing or in any challenge scenario. And I think my biggest insecurity is that I will give up or that I won't try hard enough. Like, that is the worry that if I give into a worry-based drive, that is the worry that comes up. And so my mantras are really focused on getting me through those sticky patches. And I usually, for a training session or for a race, I'll typically write out 3, and they change a little bit context dependent, but the one mantra is so basic, the one that I've used since I was 17, and it's so simple, and it probably doesn't sound powerful to other people, but it's just, I can do this. And I don't necessarily have to believe it in the moment, but I just have to repeat it to myself at the exclusion of other thoughts. Mm-hmm. And before I know it, I have done it. Yeah. If that makes sense. Like, yeah. It just anchors me to getting through whatever I'm trying to get through. And it's a little bit confidence inspiring. It's a positive message. So it does, help with encouraging dopamine levels and all those like psychological things that help you push through challenges. But I think it's been a constant mantra, and I don't always believe it, but it helps me keep moving forward. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
yeah, no, absolutely. That's amazing. And you're right. I mean, everyone's going to have the words that work for them. I was similar. I just had a few words when I was racing. And I think it's super powerful because you have a focus, right? Yeah. Instead of just letting your mind run wild, you're like, just repeat, repeat, repeat. So no, that's amazing. And I mean, I can do this. Who's not going to benefit from that? Even if doesn't become everyone's mantra. Yeah. It really is an amazing one. Well, I want to say thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. I think you've just left so many incredibly important, powerful messages. And what I feel like I'm leaving with is there's just so much more than what place you came in. Mm-hmm. Like, it's so much more. Just cycling relates to our lives so much more, and the process, and we can learn so much from the sport as athletes, and we need to broaden our focus on what matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Like, just my last little thought there is that sure, some people might care who wins, but we're not invested in sport because of the name and the result on the results sheet. We are inspired by performances that because of the context in which they occurred and what people brought to them. And you can be equally as inspired by a 20th place ride as you can with a first place ride when that person gives it everything. And I guess that's just where I see the value in sport. And it's those rides that like bring me to tears watching as a spectator of the sport. It's seeing people overcome adversity and achieve things that they didn't think they could achieve. And I don't mean objectively necessarily, but anyways, we're on the same page here. You and
Yeah, no, for sure. And you made me, I was thinking it before you said it. I completely cry when I see the last finisher of an Ironman.
Yeah.
And everything has been taken down. And there were like 40 people left at the finish line. Just brings me to tears because I'm like, oh my God, that was so hard. Like, what a champion.
Yeah.
So I completely resonate with that. It's true. It's such a great reminder about sport. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here today and just spending time with you.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Thanks for the conversation and for having me on.
Okay, good luck in the rest of your season. Have fun. Thank you so much for listening. I really enjoyed that conversation with Haley. She's incredibly introspective. I wish I had that mindset when I was still racing. I think it would have been incredibly powerful. So it's really amazing to hear how much hard work Haley has done on her mindset and how much she has learned to really enjoy the process of bike racing. Super powerful. If you want to learn more from Haley and read some of her blogs or buy her coloring book, you can follow Haley on Instagram at Haley Hunter Smith, and her website is haleyhuntersmith.com. And sounds like a really cool coloring book with some recipes, so check that out. I also know that she has some personal sponsors, so if you want to help her out in any way like that, you can get in touch with her through her website. Once again, I'm super appreciative of everyone who listens to this podcast. It's an amazing community. I'm incredibly grateful when you reach out and let me know how it's inspired you or helped you along your journey or anything you've learned. Please take a moment to share the episode with family or friends or teammates, anyone who you think can benefit from it. I'd be incredibly grateful if you could take a moment and head over to Apple Podcasts. Give the podcast a 5-star rating if you loved what you're hearing. And definitely leave a comment for other listeners or people going to check it out. What did you think of the episode? What do you think of the podcast? All of those things are amazing ways that you can support me and my podcast. And I really appreciate everyone who takes that minute to do it. So thank you very much in advance. And besides that, if you want to keep learning, I'm always pushing out my newsletter once a month where you can learn more about sports science, sports nutrition, mindset, and I usually throw in a dose of motivation. You can get to that by going to anneguzman.com, ANNEGUZMAN.com. Just scroll to the bottom of any page and subscribe there. I look forward to seeing you in the community. Follow me on Instagram at imperfectprogress.com or at GuzmanAnne. You can find me at Twitter at Guzman Nutrition and on LinkedIn at Anne Guzman. So until next time, thank you so much for listening. Remember that all progress is imperfect, and what matters is that we keep on moving forward. So whether you're crawling, walking, or running, you can do this. Keep moving, and we'll see you next time.